Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, the first in a new series from the other side of the wire, along with guest historian Professor Matthias Strohn, we begin a much requested deep dive into the story of the German army on the Western Front. This week our focus lies with the German pre-war military and how the early phases of the war unfolded from their perspective. Well, hello Dan, hello Matthias, pleasure to be joining you both on the podcast for what is a series that we've been waiting to do for various reasons for a long time. We've covered the British, we've covered the Americans, we've covered the French, and the glaring omission in all this is, of course, the opponent of those nations, and this is Germany. And we've had so many requests over the previous 100 episodes. Please do an episode or even a focus on Germany. We had you on, of course, some episodes ago, Matthias, to do this in the round, but now we get to go into it in real depth, and it's a big topic. And so really we're going to start from the very beginning, because one thing I think that's really interesting in all this is how new the German state was. And of course it was composed of much older states, but at the turn of the century, how European politicians and indeed politicians in Germany themselves were in quite a new balance of power.
Yes, and you might say this is, of course, one of the problems, and a lot of people have argued over the years that this shaking of the balance of powers that you had before the unification of Germany is one of the reasons why you end up in 1914 and you end up with the First World War. And it does really change the system in Europe. So you normally have a pentarchy of five nations in Europe, more or less controlling the continent. That shifts and changes. So in the 17th century, for example, you've got the Netherlands. Well, who would think these days, but the Netherlands is one of the key players, the major powers in Europe. You've got Spain, France, of course, Britain. And then you've got always some that come up, go down. Russia is there. And then, of course, suddenly you've got this Germany here, which is really quite confusing, because before and up to 1871, it simply doesn't exist. Now, the question is, how far back do you go here now when you talk about Germany and German history? I mean, you could go all the way back to the ancient Romans and the fight against the Romans and the Limes and the Rhine as the border, but that's probably taking a bit far, I guess. You then have the Holy Roman Empire, of course, which exists till 1806, which I think is Voltaire, wasn't he? He said it's neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, which is probably quite true. So probably the most important thing about that one from a wider European point of view is that, yes, you've got this huge thing which is called an empire, but it was completely powerless. And everyone kind of used to this, that you've got this what you might call a power vacuum in the center of Europe. And that more or less remains all the way to the 19th century. Again, it shifts and changes. Suddenly you've got Prussia rising. Of course, that becomes a dominant power in the 18th century. You've got Austria, of course, the Austrian Empire playing a role. But then you've got this big block, which really changes everything. That only happens in 1871. So quite late in the day, really.
Which is extremely interesting, actually, and of course we will get into into that power struggle when we talk about the First World War as we go through, and particularly the focus on places like Sedan, which really becomes a central hub from at least a military perspective. But what I'd be really interested to hear about, and I think maybe some of the viewers would like to know about, is what the story's like on the eve of war in Germany. It's something that we've covered with the famous Belle Epoque when we've spoken about France, we've spoken about Britain, we've even talked about life before the war in the United States. I mean, what does life look like for an average new German in Germany around about 1913, 1914?
Well, it's a time of rapid change in Germany, just like in other countries. Well, you've got the second, third phase of industrialization. Things are constantly changing. Film is arriving. Cars are arriving en masse. It's a very busy period. So sometimes today we say that the world is changing at a rate that we've never seen before. And to a degree, that's true. But to people at that time, it also felt exactly like that. So there's a bit of general confusion, you might say, within society. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, particularly through a German lens, you now have Germany here as the powerhouse of Europe. It is economically the strongest power. It's militarily the strongest power. And so far, after the wars of unification, particularly the younger generation, have just lived through this period of rapid growth, rapid expansion, economic in particular. They feel sometimes, some people have argued that there's something missing here. And some people say, oh, a war would be a great idea, wouldn't it? I mean, it probably goes more for the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, because they've grown up with these stories of Frederick the Great and the wars of unification. So that's definitely there. Very different, for example, for the working classes, which are, of course, a very, very large part of the population. They see all this very differently. There is a growing drive towards nationalism in these areas as well, in these factions of society. But this whole idea of Prussian or German nationalism is very much a thing of the middle class and the bourgeoisie, I would argue. So a very hectic, a very busy, a very confusing time in many ways internally. And also, of course, you've got political pressure that comes out of this. That's the next big thing. So you've got a structure, a state structured along very, very interesting and again confusing lines, because you've got Germany as a country, which has in those days the most advanced, most modern voting system in the entire world. Nothing to compare with what we have today, but of course in those days that was very, very modern. But then below that, because the federal country, Germany's always been a federal nation, below that you've got the individual states. And in there, you've got very, very different political systems. For example, the most conservative one is Prussia, where you have the class-based voting system. You get societies that are more liberal, and particularly the southern German states, like Württemberg, Baden, and also Bavaria. So even underneath that, you've got some sort of tensions and really interesting developments. And also we need to understand that in their understanding, you were German second. First, you were Prussian, you were Bavarian, you were Saxon, you were whatever you were. Even your passport did not state German, it stated Prussian. You had a Prussian embassy in Munich. You have a Bavarian embassy in Berlin. So again, you can see all sorts of really interesting tensions. You have a society that's really moving forward quite aggressively in time and with industrialization and modern technology. On the other hand, at least parts of the country still being kind of backward and stuck in the 18th century.
And I think one of the problems that is overriding all this that is you have a very wealthy, very powerful, both economically, both in terms of its population growth, which has been very rapid in the 19th century, and in terms of its military, which we're going to get onto. This very powerful state with, as you say, Matthias, some very modern elements to it, a very modern advanced voting system by European standards. And yet there's also some tensions within here. There's some pressures within here. And one thing in particular is how, at the very top level of German society, how it's run. And the looming figure of Kaiser Wilhelm II and his court, because in some ways, Germany is very modern and very democratic, certainly compared to Britain, which doesn't not yet have universal male suffrage compared to France. But in other ways, it's also quite autocratic. And something that interests me is that Germany as a state almost has a sort of three-part, I don't want to use the term dictatorship in pre-First World War. You can perhaps get into that by 1918. But there's basically the three power blocks. You have the Kaiser and his court, you have the Chancellor, and then you have the military as an interest block. And you can perhaps split that between army and navy as well. And one thing that strikes me, and obviously you're a much more expert on this than I am, but one thing that strikes me reading about the top tiers of German government in the early part of the 20th century is, despite the obvious power of Germany, this is now the dominant continental power, perhaps only rivaled by Russia militarily and economically, perhaps only rivaled by Britain, but surpassing Britain in many phases. What strikes me is that these power groups, there's a certain sense of not necessarily paranoia, that's pessimism almost. A fear that Germany is encircled by hostile powers, France and Russia, of course, in alliance against her. Britain, although not allied to these powers, clearly not a pro-German power either. And there's this sense of pessimism that Germany's encircled, it's trapped, it's being bound by these invisible chains, and something must be done about it, even though, by all measurable metrics, Germany is doing admirably in the early 20th century. This sort of pessimism, this suspicion, this hostility at the highest levels of German government, I think contrasts with this political modernity that we see.
No, you're absolutely right. And again, there's so many different layers to this that I mean, we've got time, haven't we? We now need probably 5, 10, 20 podcasts just to go into depth here when you talk about this. But you are right. You find these tensions. So you've got the Kaiser at the top. And these days, of course, everyone's just laughing at him and saying, well, he was a complete idiot. He didn't know what he was doing. He was bimbling along. So he is responsible for the outbreak of the war. My personal view on this is a little bit different for a number of reasons. The first reason is when you look at the actions that he takes and the speeches that he gives and the things that he does, for which he's being criticized, all of these, particularly the speeches, had been signed off by his government. The famous speech that he gives before he sends the German troops to East Asia, where he talks about the Huns. Well, there we have the link to the First World War. That had been signed off by the Chancellor and the Foreign Office. So they were perfectly happy for him to use this language. Just when they see that, whoopsie, well, that didn't go down well, they start to backpedal. So you can see that that's an ongoing discussion you've had in historian circles as well. The role of the Kaiser, how influential was he, how important was he? That's the first thing. The second thing is when he comes to power in 1888, so the year of the three emperors, he is actually seen as a breath of fresh air. He is young. He is forward-leaning. He likes technology. So he's the first guy who ditches horse carts and likes to drive around in a car, for example. He is really driving things forward. He is also a social reformer. One of the main reasons why he sacks Bismarck, who we now see as this great hero, the unifier of Germany, is because he says Bismarck is too old. He doesn't understand this. He still wants to fight all these wars against socialists, what have you. That's not how the country works anymore. We need to have these people on our side. That is the future. So that's completely written out of history in many ways. And now everyone says, well, Bismarck is the great hero. When he was sacked in the early 1890s, well, he was the villain. And everyone said the Kaiser's doing a great thing here. So that, again, even there you can see some pressure, some tension. You talked about the ministers, the Chancellor. Yes, again, the system is quite strange that you have the German system here, because not only do you have, of course, well, the national system, below that you've got the federal system. And of course, the Kaiser is also always the king of Prussia. You then have the internal system. I already talked about the voting system. The Prime Minister of Prussia then can become, not always, but can become the Chancellor. So again, all sorts of different ideas. You have infighting in German political circles at that time, before the First World War. And this goes straight to the heart of what you said, Spencer. It's this angst, this fear. How can we flex the muscles if we have to? How can we make sure that we are surrounded not only by enemies? And of course, Bismarck had done that in a very, very clever way. But then the Germans throw this away. They don't renew treaties that they've had before. They manage to cheese off the British, because Bülow, who is the Chancellor at the time, he comes up with some sort of really clever idea that if you do this and foreign policy, you can push the Brits closer to you. Actually, they keep pushing them away. So the entire German foreign policy collapses just before the First World War. And that is the main problem that they see. And they say, well, suddenly, this idea and all these, there are these caricatures where you can see Bismarck throwing all these balls up into the air, and there are all these different European nations, and he's controlling all of that, the concert of powers. He goes and it falls apart. And the consequence of all of this is that Germany in 1914 only has got one ally left, and that is Austria-Hungary. And that's all they have. There's nothing else. And even the Germans realized, looking at this map, that you have a potential two-front war, which again, caused by them because they didn't renew treaties, particularly with Russia. Even for Germany, that might be too much. And the military and also the politicians are really worried about this in 1914 and even beforehand. And when you look at the policies from Bülow, for example, you've got Bethmann-Hollweg, who is the Chancellor all the way into the First World War. Their policies are completely different as well. On top of that, you've got then the military interfering. And at that stage, because we talked about the dictatorship, and of course, lots of people have talked about the military dictatorship in the First World War. You can't, as you said, that's not the right thing to say here before the First World War. But you can still see, well, the military meddling in political affairs. And how can they do that? I mean, today that would be unheard of. When in those days they could do that because the military only answered to the Kaiser. They didn't have to answer to any politicians. They didn't have to answer to the Ministry of Defense or whatever. It's straight to the Kaiser. And so that's what they do. And in those days, particularly the Navy, it's a chap called Tirpitz who comes up with this great idea of building up a risk fleet, as he calls it. So you build a fleet which sits between 30 and 50% of the Royal Navy. His idea and his thinking is this will make the British think twice about going to war with Germany, and it might even push them into the German camp. So completely misunderstanding British psyche. So their thinking is completely flawed, and they get everything wrong that you can get wrong. And in many ways, so it's all self-fabricated and created problems on their own. One thing that you do have, before I shut up, because I've been rambling for quite a while already, is when you move closer to the First World War, there are a number of incidents where the Germans feel and think that other nations are now betraying them. And this is where perfidious Albion comes in. So this whole idea that you can't trust Britain. The one thing that in the German camp really burns all these bridges is that they know that there's a British delegation to Russia to talk about whatever. They don't know what they're talking about. And they engage with Edward Grey, the British foreign minister, and he categorically denies this. But they know that these guys are on their way. So they think, okay, all our policy, which have been based on getting closer, getting into bed with Britain, has first of all not worked, and secondly, you can't trust them. And in the German camp, that is something that's between 1912 and 1914, you can see there's a complete shift in thinking and policy, and everything is now on a much stronger war footing because they say all political bridges have been burned.
I think what's really interesting, despite those kind of self-destructive foreign policies that you've laid out very well there, Matthias, is that still on the eve of war in 1914, countries are still looking over their shoulder, suspiciously eyeing Germany, and for a very good reason. And that's something I think we need to understand here as we kind of approach the outbreak of war. And that's because the German military is truly formidable. But what I'd love to do, if you can give us a bit of an insight here, is understand exactly what that military was like. Because the whole term, even, for example, taking something as simple as the phrase the German army, in itself is a complex question and a complex story. The idea of being a largely conscript army, again, is quite problematic. It's not quite as straightforward as we see it. So in a very general term, Matthias, what exactly does the German military look like on the eve of war? How formidable really is it? And is it full of conscripts? What kind of breakdown do we see when we look at the German military forces?
Again, it is quite complex, and it is complicated. Nothing when you talk about Germany ever is easy. There we are. That's just the way it is. And that also applies to the military. Let's start at the structure of the military in very, very broad and generic terms. We already mentioned Germany is a federal country. You have a united Germany since 1871, but below that, you have got 4 kingdoms, a number of duchies, and all sorts of other entities. And it's therefore wrong to talk about the German military. The German military as one military, or for example, the German army in particular, only exists since 1919, since the end of the First World War, when you got the preliminary Reichswehr, which is the army of the interwar period. Before that, you've got contingents of the German military which form altogether the German military. What does that mean? It means that you basically have a Prussian army, you have a Bavarian army, you've got a Saxon army, and you've got a Württemberg army. You also have an army of Baden, but that's a duchy that's quite small. It's an army corps, and they're very much aligned with the Prussian army. What does that mean? It means that the king of Bavaria commands the Bavarian troops, particularly in peacetime. When it comes to war, the German emperor, who's always the king of Prussia, can declare war for all of Germany, with the exception of Bavaria. Bavarians are always different. They're very different even today. They're just different. And even in 1914, if the Bavarian king had said, I don't fancy going to war, Bavaria might have stayed out of the First World War. It was unlikely in that event, but when you look at the constitution, that could have happened. And the declaration of war says this, or the mobilization of the German forces says, the Emperor of Germany, King of Prussia, mobilizes all German troops with the exception of Bavaria. So that's the first thing that you find. You also find for that different structures within the military, different ranks. The Bavarians had very different ranks from the Prussians, for example, or a bit more leaning towards the French. They have their own officer training academies, their own staff colleges. So all that was very, very different. It disappears to a large degree during the First World War out of necessity. Up to 1914, this is very different. There was also internally in the German thinking, there was a very clear ranking who, inverted commas, the better soldiers were. And Prussia comes first. That's just very obvious. They kind of look down, not only geographically, but also in every other sense, down into the Saxons they would probably tolerate, but Bavarians and Württembergers, they're all these liberal kind of weird people in the south. No, they're not very, they can't be good officers or good militaries. It doesn't really work that way. So Prussia dominates all of this, not only because of its size, but also because of the ethos that you find in there. And you said it's an army based on conscription. It's always been the trademark for at that stage over 100 years of the German military. But again, we need to be careful when we say Germany is a fully militarized state because you've got conscription and everything is geared towards the military. That is not true. The Germans only draft about 50% of the people they could draft. And there are a number of reasons for that. The first is, as always, when you look at the military, it's money. There simply isn't enough money to go around. You then have to divide the money between the army and the navy. And the navy is important at that particular stage because the navy is not a contingent, but this is the national German navy. So this is seen as the embodiment of a new Germany. So again, you can see there's political ideas there as well. And then you also have more problems with conscription, so money being the first one. The second one is then, who do you actually draft into the military? So who do you take? You have this drive in politics that the socialists are becoming stronger. In the German Reichstag, so the national parliament, the socialists are the strongest faction. That worries people. It worries them in parliament because the one power parliament has, and that's the only power national parliament has, it sits on the money. If parliament doesn't give you more money, you don't have an army. And that's the big struggle that you find between parliament and also then the military and the Kaiser and the leading military people. But of course, it also means if you've got all these socialists in the country, particularly, for example, the Ruhr area, the industrial heartland of Germany, and you draft them into the military, first of all, physically, they're not particularly fit because they've grown up and worked in these very unhealthy conditions. And the second thing, of course, well, they're all socialists. So they want to get rid of the Kaiser, of the established regime. They want to have either revolution or some sort of change. So are you really going to get these people into the military, train them how to use weapons and all this, and then send them back home again? So they're just seen as unreliable. And all this together means that in the end, only about 50% of the troops that can be drafted are drafted. There's a big drive to an army reform. It's pushed. The push begins in 1912, and the man who's responsible for that is a chap called Ludendorff, who then becomes quite important, of course, later on in the war. And he kind of gets a half by house. So there's an increase in the troop numbers just before the First World War, but it's still not a lot. Compare that to France. France is much smaller than Germany. But when you compare the armies are basically more or less at the same size because the French mobilize somewhere in the region of, I think it's about 80%, and draft 80% of the people they can bring into the military. Germany is very different in that. But you then also have, of course, not only the conscripts, you also have a professional body around it. That's the officers, that's the NCOs. And of course, you also have this idea of the reserve officer. And you might say, why is that really important? Does that really matter? I mean, we have them today. I'm one, but yeah, okay, well, you do this, but is that really the backbone of the military? I'm not quite sure. In the First World War, when you look at what happens, the reserve officer corps becomes the backbone because all the regular ones are dead by the end of 1914. So you have that. And how does that work? So if you have a certain level of education, which is basically, if you want to compare it, is GCSE equivalent, which of course in those days not everybody had, you could volunteer. And so you would only have to serve for 1 year, not for 2 or 3, depending on where you went and what time you were drafted. But you had to pay for your uniform, for everything yourself. So that meant that you could only a very specific type of person to go down that route. First of all, you had to have education. And the second part, you had to have the money. And that meant once you've done that and you'd serve for 1 year, and that's why these guys were called the one-yearers, the Einjährigen. That meant that you could then become a reserve officer, and that was seen as something extremely prestigious in that system in Germany at that particular time.
I think we're
skirting around now, the other big issue that is confronting the German military, and you've already mentioned the problem of the relative numerical balance between Germany and France. And of course, as we discussed in our French series with James Taub, that France is hot for revenge and has been since 1870. They want to reclaim the lost provinces. They want vengeance upon Germany. That's one problem. If Germany is facing a renewed and reinvigorated France with possibly some British support, that's problem one. But of course, Germany's facing two major European nations. France, which can, by straining every sinew of mobilization, match the German numbers, at least for a time. But they're backed, of course, by Russia, the most populous European state. And although something of an enigmatic state, it always interests me that the extent to which in the early 20th century, observers of Russia and other European diplomats in Russia struggle to understand how the Russian state fully works. They veer wildly between massively overestimating the relative strength of Russia, or in some cases, massively underestimating the strength of Russia. So it's a complex state to understand. I believe it was Winston Churchill who, and I'm paraphrasing from memory, said Russia is a mystery wrapped in an enigma. And what is clear, though, to Germany in the early years of the 20th century is Russia is effectively a hostile state. Not only hostile to Germany because of its alliance with France, but hostile to Germany's only ally, Austro-Hungary, because of the Russia and Austro-Hungary's rivalry in the Balkan region as well. And so Germany has this diabolical military problem, a strategic problem, that it has a French army on its western border that is a rough equal, although I think the German military is confident that at a technical and tactical level, in many respects, the German army is stronger. But then you've got the Russian army in the east. And of course, Russia's borders are rather different to how they are now. Russia possesses huge tracts of Poland, including the current Polish capital, Warsaw. And so Russia is not too far from Berlin. And I think there's still a cultural memory in Prussia of, the Russians reaching Frederick the Great's capital in the 1700s, in the 18th century. And so Germany has this strategic problem that it just cannot get free from. It's going to have to face two major European powers at the same time. And that infuses so much planning and so much thinking. And we've talked before about the German foreign policy gets a bit derailed. There's an inconsistency. It lunges in some directions, then it veers in others. But a lot of it seems to me, it's almost in a constant state of near panic about this two-front war problem. And how much does that influence military planning, military thought, Germany's preparations for war?
It becomes more and more dominant and prominent as you go towards 1940. Well, perhaps, again, the important thing here is that this situation had been created by Germany itself. Because Bismarck had been very clever. In 1887, he signs a treaty with Russia to use the great German term Rückversicherungsvertrag. Now, if you can, give that back to me and translate it, I'll buy you a beer. And basically, it was Bismarck's idea, because he could see that France is moving closer to Russia because they wanted to encircle Germany. So he signs this treaty with them, which basically says if one of the two countries gets attacked by another nation, the not attacked nation will remain neutral. So that basically takes out the whole idea of a two-front war. This treaty expires in 1890 and is not renewed. Because Kaiser Wilhelm thinks, no, things are changing. We need to get closer to Britain. German politics at the time thinks the same. Again, it's quite a complex story. But so it's self-created, and that's the problem. You also have, when you look to the West, as you said, the French, of course, want revenge. They want to have another go. Absolutely, because they want to have Alsace-Lorraine back and all these things. The Germans see this very differently. Of course, they think, we're done in the West. There's nothing here that we want, so we just need to hold the line. We just need to defend, really, if you think about territory and all this. Doesn't align with what happens in 1914, but that's for different reasons. I mean, perhaps it's quite interesting when you look at one of the most famous songs, the very patriotic song that was being sung all the time, also when the troops then went to the front in 1914. It was called Wacht am Rhein. And that means watch on the Rhine. And when you look at the text, it's all about defending the Rhine against the French attacking. So it's not like we need to go into France to have another go. That was not really on the agenda. They understand that whatever happens anywhere in Europe, France will have a go at Germany just because of this idea of revenge. And then they look to the east. So they've really created this problem for themselves. And then they see that the French are beginning to invest quite drastically in Russia. And in particular, that means the French are financing the railways that the Russians are now building. And the railways, strange enough, are all pointing towards Germany. And that causes the big dilemma for the German military, because the Germans look at the map and say, okay, what's going to happen is whenever war breaks out now, we're going to have a two-front war. The Germans still think, because they're German, they're organized, they can do these things, they can mobilize faster the enemy. And we can go into more detail on all this in a minute. That means you now have a choice where to go, west or east. If you just stand and fight two-front war, you're going to lose it. Well, look at what happens in 1918. So you need to strike somewhere. Russia is very, very big. You've got the example of Napoleon. You go into Russia, you might just basically lose yourself in this vast territory. And at the same time, you've got the French knocking on your door. So they think because Russia is such a backward country, they might be able to fight these two enemies independently in stages. But now you've got the problem that the French are investing, and of course they're doing that for obvious reasons. They're giving the Russians all this money to build these railways to speed up mobilization, because that puts pressure on Germany. This is, from the German military point of view, when you look at all these meetings and councils that they have in 1914, even before that, the main threat for them is the Russian railways. That's what they're focusing on. They think this is really bad. So we need to strike, we need to do something in whatever shape or form before they're ready. If these are ready, we've lost. We don't even have to go to war. So that's where the military conundrum comes in. And then, of course, you've got a very, very weak ally, Austria-Hungary, which has all sorts of internal pressures as well and problems, which is basically a failing, you might perhaps even say a failed state, as it exists in 1914, just before 1914. But as I said, it's the only one that is there. There's no other ally that you can rely on. And that causes all sorts of problems for Germany in 1914.
So this kind of picture that we're building at the moment, it is leading us, of course, up to this the idea of the outbreak of war. Before we get there, of course, we're going to reach July of 1914, and we'll perhaps come on to that into a second. But just let's take a moment just to understand, as you've quite rightly laid out there, the situation. Two-front war, as we've covered many times on this podcast, is something that Germany really can't and certainly does not want to get into. Certainly not fighting two dug-in enemies on a long-term basis, which is, of course, as we know, exactly what turns out. What we haven't thrown into the mix here yet, and I think it's interesting, and probably for a very good reason, is we haven't put the British Army, the BEF, and ultimately her entire empire onto the scales. I know there's maybe a little bit of humble pie to be eaten by British historians such as Spencer and myself here. Is there a very good reason that Britain is not really taken into serious consideration in 1914 when this initial idea of the Schlieffen Plan, of which we'll then see, I don't know what, version number 17 actually enacted, is there a very good reason why Britain is really left out of the major thinking in continental Europe at that time?
Don't take it personally, guys, but to German thinking in 1914, Britain doesn't matter. As simple as that. The British army is too small. It's irrelevant. I mean, the Kaiser never talked about the irrelevant contemptibles and all this. That never happened. He never said that. But in German military planning, the British army simply doesn't play a role. It is extremely small. It's a professional army. As individual soldiers, arguably probably the best army at that particular time because it is professional. And the other armies, including the German army, based on conscription, which means you mobilize the army. And so the guys you send into battle are not only guys who are currently serving as conscripts, but people are being brought back to the colors who might have been out of the army for 5-10 years or what have you. Say it's not a particularly fit, particularly well trained. All these aspects, army. And then, of course, you need to mobilize the British army and to get the army to the continent. This is going to take time. They need to then deploy somewhere. And the German plan, the German idea is, by the stage this could have happened, the war in the West is already over. Because the German idea is you fight, as I said, you fight this campaign or this war in two different stages, first in the West, then in the East. Because in their thinking, the Russians need longer to mobilize, so you need to strike in the West first. And when you look at the German plans, the Schlieffen plan, again, we can talk about it in more detail later on, 6 to 8 weeks, that's it. That's when the campaign was supposed to be over. The Germans don't think that the British would be able to mobilize the army that quickly. Completely different story, of course, once you go into the war and you look at, in particular, the empire, the mobilization of the empire, look at blockade. So from 1916 onwards, in German thinking, Britain is actually the main enemy on the Western Front. It's not France. But it's perfidious Albion because they're starving the population, they're doing evil things, all that kind of stuff comes together. But before the war, Britain does not really play a role in thinking. It's also, for Germany as a continental power, the Navy never really played a massive role from pure military thinking. You have no linked up strategy between the army and the Navy in 1914. To the Germans, as I already said, the Navy is actually more important as an internal mechanism because it is the symbol of a united Germany. This is the national German Navy. That's why it's important. And it's not restricted by ideas of traditions, of the aristocracy, like in the army, ruling the army. If you are an up-and-coming member of the bourgeoisie, if you are an industrialist or whatever, you would send your sons into the Navy, not into the army. Because this is where the future lies. This is the technical branch. It's driven by the bourgeoisie. That's why, to the Germans, the Navy is far more important from an internal point of view. In Germany, no one really ever seriously thought about going to war with the Royal Navy because they understood, well, we can't redo that. Even Tirpitz doesn't mention it. Again, you come back to the whole idea of politics where they really, really screw this up, to be perfectly honest. But again, that's a different matter. But very long, rambling answer to your very precise question. So in the German military planning on land in 1914, the British Army really doesn't play a role.
I think that speaks a little bit to Germany's approach to planning the war entirely, because something that I think comes out really strongly, really for Germany throughout the First World War, and we can revisit this over the miniature series we're doing on Germany, is it thinks about, at a military level, it thinks about everything in terms of battles, in terms of armies, in terms of maneuver. It doesn't have a strategic vision for the war beyond the military will win, and that will solve the strategic problem. And this is one of the reasons I think that every solution that the German state comes up with is win a battle and this will solve the problem. And it's that old thing, when all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And Germany's great strength in international relations is its fearsome army, which, despite the weaknesses you've laid out, Matthias, is still intimidating to all its neighbours, and intimidating indeed to Britain. Just the sheer size, the weight, the power of this army. This is the army that had crushed France so effortlessly in 1870-71. So there's this element that the army will solve the problems, and then the politicians will will sweep at the pieces and clean it all up. And this is going to lead us to the I think, one of the most fascinating plans, one of the most studied plans, one of the most discussed plans. And listeners who aren't deeply interested in the goings-on in peer-reviewed military journals, way back in the 2000s, there was a long-running debate about the Schlieffen plan that became so technical and so torturous that in the end it required an entire conference being called to try and sort out what the historians were arguing about, and they couldn't solve it. And this is the Schlieffen plan, which a fascinating plan, an incredibly ambitious plan for the era. But also, Matthias, it's a plan that is all about using just military force to solve this wider strategic problem of Germany being encircled, and the idea that, okay, so it's hugely risky, there's danger here, particularly if we draw Britain into the war by entering through Belgium, but none of that's going to matter because we're going to solve this with a great victory and strategic consequences. They'll all be positive for us. And we have to dive into this here, I think, Matthias. So tell us a little bit about the origin of the Schlieffen plan and where it is by 1914, because of course it starts to evolve after it's initially created.
Well, maybe I take you a little bit further back because we're talking about the whole military culture and relationship with the politics and politicians. Say maybe one or two words about political culture in Germany at that particular time. You can say it in a nutshell, political culture is very, very ill-developed and very, very poor. There are a number of reasons for that. One of the reasons is that Parliament and politicians don't really have anything to say. So you don't really make any decisions in Parliament because you don't answer to the ministers don't answer to you. They answer directly to the Kaiser. You're in charge of money, but that's it. But that means, for example, there's not a political culture which tries to reach a deal, come to a compromise. Compromise solutions are nothing that the Germans do in the political sphere. Because they say, well, this is my position and I just fight to the death for it. And that spills over, you might say, into the executive as well. You also, of course, have this the idea, the tradition of particular Prussia rather than the other German states as this military might, and military might can create solutions. In the German understanding, that goes all the way back to the 30 Years' War. It goes particularly back to Frederick the Great. So, well, he fights these wars, and when he fought these wars, suddenly Prussia is one of the main powers in Europe. He puts Prussia on the map with military might. There is some truth in it. However, they completely forget that, of course, he was also a politician. You then go into the Wars of Unification. And even Bismarck talked about this and said, well, the questions of our time are not decided by words, but by blood and iron. And so it's all about this military solution. And then, of course, you might say, yeah, if you're not an expert and you look at what happens in 1870-71, that looks like a proper military solution to a political problem. You defeat the French in the field of battle, and you get a united country. No one's, of course, really aware of what goes on behind the scenes, the political stuff, because that's all secret. So to the wider public, and also most of the politicians themselves, because these political ideas weren't really shared with normal politicians, it looks as if a military solution is actually quite a useful one. And as you say, well, yes, there are shortcomings with the army, but it's still quite powerful. So if you can give the French a whack, you're probably going to win this one, if it's just the French. So you do get this idea. And this is why you then have, in some circles, kind of this military thinking taking over. When you look at the development of the Schlieffen plan, it is interesting to see that, to begin with, the politicians are actually quite against this. And particularly Bethmann Hollweg, who is the chancellor when the war breaks out, he is very anti-military. But because of the structure that I mentioned earlier, so generals can go directly to the Kaiser and talk to him. They don't have to go via the chancellor or via any other politicians or ministries or anything like this. That, of course, means that you've got this triangle here, and that is a big problem. And when we look at the Schlieffen plan, where it comes from, of course, it's called Schlieffen plan after Count Alfred von Schlieffen, who is the head of the general staff, and he looks at this problem that Germany has, and it's around the turn of the century, actually, so relatively early on. And he looks at this and thinks, okay, two-front war, how are we going to do this? How are we going to solve this particular problem? And he then comes up with this idea that, well, you need to have, as I already said, you need to have a phased approach. And that can only mean you are going to have to attack the French first, because they're able to mobilize faster than the Russians. And once you've defeated these guys, then you move to the east. And that's all very interesting, because when you go back to 1870-71, which of course he takes as one of the examples while the French were defeated, well, actually, it wasn't under 6 to 8 weeks. The imperial army is defeated. You then have an uprising, and you've got a people's war against the German invaders. So this whole idea is really quite interesting. When we look at this, does that thinking really make sense? Not necessarily so, but he says that's the only solution that we have to this. And then, of course, when you look at this, the big debate, well, Terence Suber, of course, well, the guy who came up with all these ideas, he talked about the conference. I remember the conference well. I was there. He and, of course, other people have also argued that it's not necessarily a pure military problem that he's addressing here. Because when you look at the composition of the force and the force that he wants to use to invade France, he is actually on paper in this plan, started in 1905, then refined, and we can go through the different stages later on. He's actually using troops that Germany doesn't have. There are a number of army corps that he puts on the map, and says, well, these are the troops that we need. So this is the argument of this whole debate around the Schlieffen plan. Was it actually a military plan that was supposed to be put into action, or was that more of a political plan, taking this plan to the politicians and telling them, well, if you give us more money for a handful of extra army corps, this is what we could achieve. Open bracket, probably not trying to put that into practice at all, but just using that as the argument to enlarge the army. So that's the underlying debate that you find here. And again, it is the military solution to a political problem. And it's one of the problems that you find in the German military on the whole, all the way up to 1945, is that German military people, senior officers, are not able or willing really to think in political terms. They think about the military and military solutions to military problems. they don't really have this wider idea of what does that mean for politics and how is that influenced by all of this. Schlieffen plan, again, more detail probably later, when he says, well, we need to go through Belgium. So the political implications, of course, Britain and all this, he rules that completely. I said, I'm not interested. That's not my problem. My problem is a military solution to a military problem. That is really quite stark. You find that all along and all the way through, they do not engage in political matters. It was also a culture. They didn't want to engage in political matters because they said the moment you bring political thinking into the military at whatever level, you're no longer having a unified and united body, but you get political factions within the military. So, for example, all the way up to 1945, people in uniform were not allowed to vote. They didn't have neither the active nor the passive vote. Because they said, no, we are serving the country, the state, but not politicians, not factions or something like this. So that's another underlying reason why you don't have political thinking in there. I'll probably leave it at that for the moment. I know we're going to go into more detail when it comes to the Schlieffen plan, but just because I keep rambling, don't I?
I'm used to working with Spencer, so I wouldn't worry. This is a usual kind of thing. So it's very interesting to get into the detail, and that's the whole point of doing a mini series actually about this subject. And Spencer, I just want to throw to you for a minute actually, because as we're approaching the kind of the eve of war here, and we've been teetering on that edge before we're going to spill over eventually to August of 1914. But before we get there, is it worth understanding what the equivalent position is like in Britain at that same time? Because there are plans being put in place by the German army. It's a theoretical plan at this time, and nobody's really sure if it's ever going to need to be enacted. But by the time we get to 1914, the idea, certainly in Britain, is that possibility is getting ever closer. And so from a British point of view, in wondering what the Germans are planning to do themselves, what kind of preparations are we making from that point of view?
Well, that's a really good question, probably deserves its own episode. But really from 1906 onwards, which is the first really big crisis of the 20th century, which is the Moroccan crisis, a long, complex history. France has imperial interests in Morocco. Germany provokes France by making comments that they will support the Moroccan semi-independence, really. It's basically saying, don't be in the French Empire, be in the German Empire. That's a gross oversimplification, but that's the summary of it. And this is sometimes seen as Germany testing, well, how committed is Britain to France? Britain and France had signed the Entente Cordiale, the friendly understanding, in 1904. And this is, well, okay, when the chips are down, are you going to come and fight for France? And this is a time when France is potentially very vulnerable. Russia's just lost the Russo-Japanese War. It's been racked with revolution. There's all kinds of problems. And if there's an opportunity to pounce on France when it's isolated, it's going to be in 1906. So the British take this very seriously. And this is the beginning of British serious war planning about what happens. And what it's all hinged on is the British war game is played by the general staff that says the Germans are going to invade through Belgium. It makes sense. The British study this and say, well, the shared border is super heavily defended. If the Germans try and come through there, it's going to be a bloodbath. It's not going to work. The Germans are going to swing through Belgium. And initially, the British think it's going to be just through southern Belgium, so through the Ardennes region. But even so, that's a serious problem. The British don't like that idea because it brings the Germans dangerously close to the Belgian ports, which threaten British trade lines. Britain has a treaty to defend Belgium. So from 1906, this is when plans start to develop. But what's interesting is it's widely accepted, although subtly accepted. You'll struggle to find a document saying, yes, we definitely think the Germans are coming through Belgium, but there's this real concern at a high level. Germans are going to come through Belgium. We might have to go out and do something with this. What the British avoid doing with very British style is committing themselves to a really formal plan about what do we do if that happens. And about as far as it goes is if the Germans do go through Belgium and Britain is drawn into the war, we will send the regular army. So 6 infantry divisions and a cavalry division will go out and they'll join the French and they'll do what they can to stop the Germans. But in terms of actually anticipating exactly how the Germans might enter Belgium, relations with the Belgian army, because Belgium is absolutely avowedly neutral. In fact, relations between Britain and Belgium are quite poor prior to 1914 because the British government has been very critical of the Belgians in the Congo. And so tensions are actually quite high between Britain and Belgium. In terms of actually planning what will happen once the army arrives and enters Belgium, very little is done. It's open-ended, the British plan. And it's interesting from the German perspective, there is some consideration at various times what if a British army ends up in our way during the Schlieffen plan? And on one level, the Germans think, well, it's not very likely. The British won't be able to mobilize that fast. They won't be able to get troops out. And even if they do, the British army is very small, which it is. We'll just blow them away. They'll just be absolutely overrun. It doesn't matter. They can do nothing. They're not going to help France. We're going to blast through Belgium. The British are in the way, blow them out of the way, and encircle the French. And just to emphasize the sort of flexible nature of British plans, the day Britain declares war, of course, on the 4th of August, and then the next day, Herbert Asquith calls a crisis meeting. He's the Prime Minister. He calls a crisis meeting at number 10 Downing Street, and he opens this meeting, and he says, we've considered lots of plans for war, but we've never committed to a plan. What are we going to do? And various military planners then come up with various ideas. So Douglas Haig says, keep the army back for 6 months, use it to build up a massive force. John French says we should go straight to Antwerp and try and get on the German flanks. And the man who's sort of been doing all the planning for this, Henry Wilson, he says, you're mad. We've been planning to move the army to southern Belgium for years. We've got to do that. And in the end, he gets his way. But it speaks a little bit about how open-minded the British are. They're very flexible on what they might do. And of course, it's not entirely clear Britain will join the war, which is, of course, what Germany is hoping for. But one of the things I think, and if you listen to our earlier series about the French, with James, when he talked about the French plan is pretty clear. They're going to mobilize and they're going to go into their lost provinces and they're going to reclaim them at the point of the bayonet. They've got a very clear plan. The Germans have a very clear plan. They're going to launch the Schlieffen plan, try and outflank the French as they go into the disputed provinces. And then into this comes the British army, which says we're going to arrive, we're going to try and get ourselves in a useful position, and we'll work it out once we're in the field, which is largely what's going to happen in 1914.
And it's interesting what you say about this non-committal bit, because as you said, well, the Germans and the French as well, of course, they're completely and fundamentally different. So when you look at the German war planning, originally, when you look at this emerging two-front threat, they actually have two plans. They've got one plan for deployment against France, they've got one plan for deployment against Russia. Since 1905, the one going against Russia in the first phase, well, that's kind of like dropped more or less, but it's still there. It's still in the drawer somewhere. You can take it out and you can update it and mobilize and send the troops to the east. Shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, that plan gets dropped. So that means whatever happens in Europe in 1914, the Germans can only do one thing, and that is attack France through Belgium. There is this episode that when the July crisis, and again we can talk about this in more detail later on. During the July crisis, a telegram arrives from London, because the German ambassador had been asked to go to court and have to the court and have a discussion with the British about what's going to happen in the crisis and this and that. And he sends a message back to Berlin in which he says, well, it looks as if the British are going to keep out of the war, just like you said, Spencer. That's the big hope, isn't it? And the Germans then think, okay, if the British don't get involved, that might mean that the French are not going to start a war at all because they think on their own they're not strong enough. So maybe we just send all the troops to the east. Kaiser is very, very happy, has the champagne open and says, well, my dear Moltke, who's then the chief of the general staff, well, change of plan, we're going east. At which point he says, my dear Kaiser, we can't do this. We don't have a plan for this. We can't just turn an entire army around. It doesn't work that way. And then, of course, a few hours later, another telegram arrives from London. Terribly sorry, completely misunderstood. No, it looks as if Britain is going to go to war, so we're back on track. But there's this window of what they see as an opportunity for a few hours, and the military say, no can do. And when you look at the planning, because once you are committed, I mean, the thinking that they had about all of this was quite impressive in many ways. So the real heroes of the German army at that stage, and they're also seen like that, were the guys from the transport section of the general staff. Because twice a year they updated the mobilization plans. And when you look at the western border, of course, you've got the River Rhine flowing all along there. You didn't have that many bridges crossing the Rhine in those days. And when you look at the mobilization plans, there was a train going across the bridge in Cologne, for example, every 3 minutes. And that was how meticulous was planned. Get the troops in from East Prussia, which in those days, Eastern Germany, including East Prussia, Silesia, Pomerania, all these things, all the way across to the west in a 3-minute tacting. So basically, that's extremely meticulous. And also the French are picking up on this. So what the French are realizing, something is happening here, and the Germans are getting ready for war. It's not because the Germans are having more exercises or anything like this. Not quite sure we talked about this in the French episodes, but it's actually because the Germans are extending the railway stations. And the French are measuring them, the French spies, and they come to the conclusion that the new length of the German railway station is exactly a battalion train. So basically, you get a train up, put everyone on a train, and the train drives off again. And that's exactly the same length. So, okay. You see, there's some very meticulous planning, so very, very different from what you find on the British side.
So there we have that picture. I think is a great one to round up this episode, Matthias, with hundreds of thousands of German troops heading westwards towards a border as yet unknown, certainly not unknown to the Germans, but to exactly where that hammer blow is going to fall is not quite clear just yet. The British hanging on and wondering exactly what's going to kick off. And stay with us, ladies and gents, because this is just the start of a series looking at the story, of course, from the German perspective of the Great War in the Western Front. Come and join us next week as those very first moves of the Great War are going to be played out on the Western Front. We're going to follow the action all the way through to 1918. Thanks a huge amount to Matthias for joining us this week. Always worth mentioning, for those of you that haven't already been introduced to it, of course, you are one of the two hosts on our sister podcast, World War II, Both Sides of the Wire. Give us a quick heads up for anyone that wants to head over there right now and find out what it's about. What kind of things do you cover there?
Well, as you already said, it's both sides of the wire, and we're trying to bust all these myths of the Second World War. And as you already said, we've got two hosts, so myself, mainly looking at the German side, and Jesse Alexander, who is mainly covering the Allied side. So we're looking at myths, we're looking at battles, we're looking at campaigns, and we're comparing, contrasting, analyzing from both sides. And that really makes it very interesting because, as you can imagine, we come from very different angles. Perhaps not personal, but when you look at sources and when you look at what the Germans say about a battle, what the Allies are saying about a battle, and trying to find this common ground and trying to really bust all these myths, that's what our podcast is all about.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
We could do a multi-part one. We could do, we could do.
I'm only slightly concerned that I don't want to end up asking too much of you, Matthias, and doing a 30-part series on this.
That would be quite good fun, but yeah.